Hello and welcome to our module in which we focus a little bit more on what language has to do with publication success. All right. So in this video, we'll be looking at this question here. What role does language play in the likelihood of an article getting accepted or rejected by an article, by a journal? And one of the main messages here today is that academic writing is highly formulaic. What do I mean by that? Well, uh, the way in which information is presented in an academic research article tends to be highly formulaic, following a particular set of rules and a particular sequence that have been conventionalized over the years. And if an author breaks these particular conventions or doesn't meet these conventions to the satisfaction of the reviewers, for example, it tends to weigh negatively on an article. Academic writing is also highly formulaic in the sense of the language that is used um, in academic writing. And in the subsequent videos, especially after this one, you will see some ways of capitalizing on that, whether you are a native speaker of English or not. Um, this is an image that was borrowed from the publisher Elsevier, and they've chosen the motif of a fish. And the fattest part of the fish here is supposed to correspond to what's called the main body of the text, the main part of the text, which is the introduction section, which is usually followed by the method section in an article, then the results, and then discussion. The acronym is IMRAD, and you'll hear this acronym over and over again in this course. IMRAD is the typical formulaic structure of a research article, but your results may differ depending on um, your particular discipline. Sometimes there'll be a mention of the method in the introduction, or maybe even the results, and so on. But this is sort of the archetypical formulaic research structure. Different researchers have looked at why articles get rejected, and these readings will be made available to you on our class page. And I just want to focus here on a couple of them, actually one in particular that I think kind of represents all of or at least the vast majority of the studies that are highlighted here. But again, you can look more deeply into these articles on your own. But looking at McKercher and colleagues' research on why manuscripts were rejected in the Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Research. So basically what they did was they looked at all of the rejections and what the comments, and they kind of divided the comments or categorized the comments into different themes. And here you see a kind of nice inventory of what those themes were, where the most important issue or most common category for rejection, with 74% of the manuscripts having this particular category, was in a problem to do with methodology. And this is followed by a problem with what McKercher et al. Call the significance. So the author's apparent inability to answer the so what of the research. Why is this important? Why does this research matter? That so what? And then finally, writing style. Um, and then if you look down this sort of inventory of categories that the authors highlight, you can see that there isn't a category related to the English language per se, so native or non-native English necessarily, but there is a sort of uh, a broad spectrum of issues that lead to, but the ones that are at the top here, methodology and significance, um, those two stand out, and they do tend to stand out in most studies. But I want to look for a second at this third one, writing style, which constituted nearly 60% of the categories in the reviews of manuscripts that were rejected. And I'd like to look more closely at what they mean by that. So in quality of writing, they subdivide that category into poor, sloppy grammar, punctuation, spelling. So proofreading, that's an important thing. We'll talk about that in a second. Inappropriate wordings or terms used, and inappropriate title. Okay, so McKercher et al. Also asked reviewers to kind of do a kind of what's called a think aloud, where they would verbalize their thoughts while they were conducting a review. So relaying, okay, what's going through their heads while they're reading a manuscript that they're not that has a problem. And here is a couple of remarks that are good examples of what might be going through a reviewer's head when they're looking at a manuscript that isn't up to snuff. The first one here, oops, there are numerous grammatical and logical faults. So notice the grammar is mentioned here, but also this logical fault throughout the entire manuscript. I have basically stopped copy editing the manuscript after the first sentence. The author should have found a professional editor to proofread the manuscript before sending it to a refereed research journal. So it's not just that there are grammar issues, but there seem to be problems with understanding the relationship between one idea and the next. And then also, this next remark, careless editing. How can an article be submitted with question marks on references? So should reviewers make a guess? So this author or these authors submitted an article that clearly had not been carefully proofread by them, including question marks in works cited. So that was just sort of careless, really. It would appear. But this logical faults matter is something that is very interesting and something I would like to take a closer look at. And McKercher talks a bit more about that and says, and relates this to being poorly structured, and says many papers are also poorly structured. This kind of goes back to the whole formulaic issue, the fish with the IMRAD, the typical structure of a paper. Poor structure restricts the author's ability to elucidate the core thesis clearly. So it's not made clear early, apparently, according to what McKercher and al. Found. It's not made clear what the contribution or the novelty of the paper is, what the main point is. Such problems usually manifest themselves in a paper that lacks focus, rambles, and contains much irrelevant information. So much more than language itself, much more than the quality of English or whether there is correct grammar or lexis used. One report noted that the paper never really gets started. By page 8, the authors are still telling us what they intend to do in the paper. By page 18, the reader is still waiting to see what the paper is all about. So you can feel that the reviewers were frustrated that the author doesn't seem to be making a point, or it's taking too long to make one. This is much more than about the English language per se. In other words, this seems to be more about the presentation of information meeting the expectation of at which point that should be made clear to the reader, what the author's point is. So I provided here a summary of, and this will be on your course page, of the main reasons, according to a survey of some papers that have looked at why manuscripts get rejected, the main reasons articles get rejected. And I'd like you to pay close attention to the X's and the check marks. So on the left-hand column here, you have the full inventory of all the categories, all the themes or reasons why articles get rejected as indicated by these authors. And then where there's an X, it means that the author mentioned this as an issue, or rather, where there's an X, it means the author did not mention this as an issue. If there's a check mark, it means that it was mentioned as an issue in that study. So with Belcher, for example, Diane Belcher's paper, she does not mention that articles are often sent to the wrong journal, but the other three here Bordage, Sullivan, and McKercher, they do. Take a look at um, which problems or which reasons for rejection have a consensus across all 4 studies. As you can see, Belcher, Bordage, Sullivan, McKercher, they all mention faulty method. They all mention issues with the discussion section. They all mention this writing being difficult to follow. They mention issues with the literature review. They mention issues with the novelty, issues with the contribution not being clear. And none of them mention issues to do with native or non-native like English. That's never an issue. That's never stated as a direct contribution to an article being rejected. There is such a thing as what's called a desk rejection, which is when an editor receives a journal article and or the editor's assistant looks at the article and sees that the English is of such poor quality that I mean it's hard to even read at all because the English is so poor. Those often don't even go out for review. Here we're talking about, that's called a desk rejection. Here we're talking about articles that went out for review, may have had issues with English, but this was not cited. These were the English issues with English per se were not cited by these researchers here as being main causes for rejection. Instead, these other ones are. And these 2 things will come up again over and over in this course as issues with problems with writing being difficult to follow and issues with nothing new or contribution not being clear. And I want to focus on this writing being difficult to follow in today's video.
Right. So here what you see is a kind of questionnaire that we receive as reviewers of manuscripts. We're asked by journals to use this questionnaire in order to decide if a manuscript is worthy of being published in a particular journal. The more yeses we respond positively to, then the more merit the manuscript has. More no's would be indicative of a manuscript that should be rejected, probably.
Look at the very top question on the questionnaire, which is, does the manuscript contain new and significant information to justify publication? That is one of the top issues and top reasons why reviewers will reject an article if they cannot identify, they cannot clearly answer this question. A lot of authors, academic authors, whether they be native speakers or not of English, when they have a comment when they receive a comment from reviewers related to this, that writing is difficult to follow, they may think that it has to do with grammar and vocabulary or other surface error issues. Sometimes even the reviewers may think that. In reality, in my experience, the issue is deeper than that. And I'm going to show you what I mean. Look at these 2 statements. I live in San Francisco. I always keep a flashlight and spare batteries ready. And you might look at those 2 statements and think, huh? And that's what most people would say if they're not from San Francisco, because they wouldn't necessarily see the connection between these 2 things. To me, in my head, there is a clear connection. Why? Because San Francisco is a seismic city. I am from San Francisco, and I have lived through earthquakes. And I know that it is important to keep a flashlight and spare batteries, sometimes in several different parts of the house, so that if the electricity goes out, which the city does automatically in a major earthquake in order to not to spark fires, in case of an earthquake, then, and if it's night and dark, I'll have some sort of source of light. These days, you can do that from your cell phone too. So in my head, the connection is clear, but to the reader, of these two statements, there is a logical fault between this statement and this. I would add something. Um, I live in San Francisco, comma, where there are a lot of earthquakes, comma, and I always keep a flashlight and batteries ready because the electricity often gets turned off in these situations or something better than that. Um, so this is actually a common issue with papers, this logical fault, which in the writer's head, there is a clear connection between one idea and the next, yet that connection is not being made clearly um, in the actual research article. And so while you can fix, you can have perfect, whatever that means, English language, that doesn't necessarily mean that the writing is clear. You could say that there are sort of three levels of variables that can contribute to publication success or failure. One being that of language, language meaning is there correct grammar, correct pronunciation, or rather correct punctuation, correct vocabulary and terminology, sort of surface, superficial correctness in language. Beneath that, or another layer, which is that of writing or discourse, which is things to do with how clear the writing is, how logical the writing is, how it flows, the organization, the structure of the article. Does it meet the kind of formulaic convention of the genre? And then finally, the research itself, which is what you do from the very beginning when you start to build your research design for your particular study, including if they're going to be participants and who those people are going to be and how you're going to conduct the research, the method, if there will be any instruments, what the means of analysis will be, and all that data collection. That's the research.
So we have some control over, in the writing process, over the top two layers. But I would argue that we can see these in a different kind of format, that being as a kind of, with different weights on a kind of pyramid, where the base of the pyramid is the research. That's the biggest, that makes up the bulk of your paper. If you don't have a good basis, the basis of the pyramid, if that's not solid, if that's not in place, then the whole thing will basically just collapse. And you do have two elements, the two elements I just mentioned, uh, that we have some control over in the writing process. That is control over the language that we use, and then the writing itself. But uh, while those are important, they are not nearly as important as the research. So, um, however, at the same time, I can also see that if that top, more narrowly focused part of the pyramid is not uh, in place, then it can obscure the rest of the pyramid. So, poorly worded paper can also cause problems.
Writing actually is a larger part, a more substantial part of contributing to the success or not of a manuscript being um, accepted. Writing, as I mentioned, is to do with how well you have structured the article, how clear you have made your ideas, how the writing flows. Uh, are there logical faults or not? Is there unnecessary information being included in the article? Have you made the novelty, what your contribution is to whatever research area you're writing in, have you made that clear? On the other hand, I think an argument could also be made to that if uh, if the language is very problematic, that top layer of the pyramid, it almost can obscure the layers beneath it. So a, a language, or rather an article that is riddled with language errors, uh, might might obscure, trammel your vision of, uh, or a reviewer's vision of the layers beneath it. Might not be able to see the writing very well, and certainly not the research. Make it difficult to see what the value of the research. You can fix the language but and you can have English, perfect English, but if you have perfect English, it doesn't mean if you have bad research, it's still going to be a kind of if you have bad presentation of the information, disorganized, doesn't flow, and doesn't meet that particular academic formula that I showed you, the IMRAD structure, for example, then you end up with not a very pretty picture, but a kind of troll of instead of a Cinderella of a manuscript. English itself, language itself, does not make for a good manuscript. It's the other, all those other variables that I've shown you in today's video so far that seem to weigh more heavily.